Right, I have been told that we are now live. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. If you've managed to grab some lunch, congratulations. There's been so much interesting stuff going on. It's been difficult to tear oneself away from the screen. It's my great honour to introduce two speakers today, Claudia Chapman and Katherine Garrett-Cox, and we're going to be having a conversation about disclosure, reporting and accurate measurement, if such a thing is possible. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will have the opportunity to put forward your questions. I can't promise that we'll answer them all in real time, but please do let us have your opinions. So I'd like to kick off, if I may, with a little quote from Malcolm Bradbury, the history man. Culture is a way of coping with the world by defining it in detail. But the question, therefore, is what is the detail that should be disclosed and reported, and is it actually going to be accurate? And so I'd like you to have that at the back of your mind when you're talking about your different perspectives about what is accurate and what is relevant to report and disclose. So I'm going to start by handing over, first of all, to Claudia, who's going to give herself a little bit of introduction, and then over to Katherine. Each of them will give about 5 or 6 minutes just to explain their place in the world on this very, very important issue. So over to you.
Thanks,
please,
Sarah,
Claudia.
and thank you for the opportunity to join this session. So my name's Claudia Chapman, and I joined the Financial Reporting Council 5 years ago to lead a review and a report that we published on corporate culture and the role of boards, and we brought together a sort of coalition of stakeholder organisations to look at that important issue. And we came up with, we did a lot of interviews with FTSE boards and CEOs and also managers and organisations to understand this point of corporate culture and how important it was. And we did, we established that it was actually critical to the functioning of an organisation and also its place in society. And that report led to some changes to the UK Corporate Governance Code in the latest issue of the UK Corporate Governance Code around purpose, values and culture in the organisation, around the monitoring and measurement of that as well. And before that, I worked for the ACCA, Chartered Certified Accountants, on a campaign of corporate governance, raising corporate governance standards in developing markets, and a number of other business development and learning roles there at ACCA. But most recently, I've been working on the UK Stewardship Code. We issued the update or significantly reviewed UK Stewardship Code, which is a best practice code for asset managers, asset owners, and the service providers that support them about the activities and outcomes of the work that they do to look after the assets that are entrusted to their care, operating on behalf of others. So we published a new code a year ago this month. And it took effect on the 1st of January, and we're expecting the first formal reports and applications to the code to come through in the next year, so very early next year, the first quarter of next year. And we've actually just undertaken a review of some early reporting that we've had to the code, which is really, really encouraging. And I just say that, yeah, so what I'm hoping to get out of this session is a really interesting discussion about sort of the balance of rules and regulation and different approaches to reporting across the piece. And I think hand over to Katherine now.
Thanks very much. So Katherine, over
Thank you, Claudia and Sarah. It's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion this afternoon. So I am CEO of GIB Asset Management in the UK. My perspective on this topic is I've been an investor for more than 30 years, and I think that culture really sits at the heart of a company. It really is the beating heart of, I think, what people really need to be looking at. I think particularly in today's world, what's become really clear to me is that I think perhaps on the back of the COVID crisis, more and more CEOs are really recognizing that culture is fundamentally important, not only for client outcomes, but also for resilience of your organization and most critically for business performance. So I think what I'd really like to get out of the session today is a real sense of why it matters and actually what organizations are doing to really put these things into play within their own companies. And for GIB Asset Management, our whole DNA is centered around being conscious of the mark we leave. And we've been doing this for some time now. I think the fact of the matter is we sit here in a world where, as Sarah Breeden said in her keynote earlier, climate change is the defining moment. It's the defining thing that we need to tackle. But we also have COVID, and all of these converging factors really mean that people are living in a very uncertain place, in a very uncertain employment world. And therefore, I think culture is even more important. And sometimes, I think, you know, when you're faced with a near-term issue, if you think you've got 10 years to solve the climate crisis, you might just push these issues to the back burner. And I hope really that in the conversation we're going to have today, both from a regulatory perspective and from a practical perspective, we can encourage people to really put this front and center of their corporate agenda.
Super, thanks very much, Catherine. So we've all got a grounding in sort of what we see, culture. Coalition building is also a theme that I'm hearing from both of you, which has clearly played a large part in sort of your professional roles. But Claudia, could you kick off a little bit about how FRC is going around accurate measurement? There are many things about ESG and climate which are very subjective. And I've over the past 25 years, I've seen lots of debates coming out from issuers about, oh, well, you don't understand, you know, this is what's important to us, you're not measuring us correctly, etc. Well, wouldn't it be so much easier if we just had some hard and fast rules that we could stick to, and then you could mark our homework for us? So how has FRC responded to that challenge and that opportunity, and how is it changing from what went before?
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, there's quite a lot, and we could answer this in a couple of different ways. So I'll just maybe give a little bit background about the FRC and some of the recent, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with the Financial Reporting Council, just quickly. So we were subject to a number of external reviews by Sir John Kingman and Sir Donald Bryden, and then the Capital Markets Authority reviews, and recommending lots of a huge number of changes to the organisation, but broadly around us having sort of greater powers and perhaps changing our practices in certain ways. So you know, we've responded to those and continue to do so, and we have a transformation program in place to tackle some of those. But one of those things is about having, you know, greater powers to perform our duties, and I think there's, you know, the role that the FRC has is sort of twofold. We have some powers in some areas, and our role is more one of encouragement and certainly in respect to the stewardship code. So around, you know, and so there's some things, for example, with the stewardship code and the corporate governance codes, where there's much more flexibility in the way in which organizations respond to those principles and provisions. They're not, you know, rules as such. There's some expectations, and there's a lot of opportunity to report very well. But that does mean that there's some areas where there's scope for people to maneuver, perhaps. So what I mean, in relation to sort of environmental reporting, ESG reporting, and carbon, we're starting to you know, there is a need for a global standard, and we recognise that, and it's likely that the FRC will come out shortly with a clearer statement about our view going forward. But we're hearing a lot of support, for example, for TCFD and SASB as some potential answers to the reporting puzzle. And we also welcome that, you know, the consultation the IFRS has come out with in respect to that. So I think, you know, we do recognise the need for some standardisation in certain areas, and understanding the basis on which some of these calculations are made. But you know, it's a complex and difficult and emerging area.
Yes, because if we ask the wrong question, we could be precisely wrong, even though the measurement is perfectly accurate. It could just well be the very wrong measure. So if we think back over the past 25 years in the attempts sort of in the governance sphere to improve this, what do you think is going to be different about the future to what we saw going in the past? Because it's in theory, it's taken 25 years or so to get to where we are now. If we've only got 10 years to save the planet, we need to redouble our efforts on what we've actually accomplished so far. So how are we going to ensure that the disclosure is actually accurate? What sort of assurance do you think that, because investors, everybody is complaining about quality of data and everybody's finger pointing at one another at the moment. We need to get past finger pointing and start getting practical. So what do you think are going to be the key issues from FRC's perspective on that?
Yeah, sure. So
I mean,
in relation to climate, we're shortly about to publish our a thematic report about climate, which looks at a number of different areas of responsibility that the FRC has, and the way in which climate fits into that. So, for example, in terms of the streamlined energy and carbon reporting requirements, but also in relation to how investors are reporting on climate and material ESG disclosures, but also looking at the role of auditors and how they are assessing audits and very much how they're looking at supporting the organizations that they work for and ensuring that the way in which climate disclosures are made are being audited effectively. So we're looking at it from lots of different points of view. And I think, you know, there is a role for auditors to play. There is a role for investors absolutely to play in terms of challenging the assumptions on which information is calculations are made from companies and the information that is provided to them. And I mean, even going right back down to the you know, I know that the Make Money Matter conversation is going to happen after ours, and even giving savers and pensioners and feeling empowered to ask questions of their pensions, and then subsequently the companies in which they invest. So I think, you know, that having that ability to empower individuals is important, and giving that information so that they're not sort of necessarily bombarded with lots and lots of figures which don't necessarily make any sense. So there's a role to be had in not only checking the accuracy of that information, but also distilling that into a meaningful way for the different audiences. You've disappeared, Sarah. So maybe we have to run this on our own. Catherine will have to do this on our own.
Sure.
We've lost her. Okay.
We'll carry on.
Well, so I think my perspective is that I find it really interesting that only now have these conversations become part of the mainstream debate. As somebody who has probably spent the last 15 years, particularly focused in the ESG space, but has been an investor 15 years before that, I kind of can't really sort of rationalize why these factors and areas of disclosure weren't always important to people. I mean, clearly I'm delighted that suddenly it's now leapt into the forefront of everybody's mindset. But I do find it strange that it's almost taken a series of crises to raise awareness on these points. So I think, you know, I have to say, I think TCFD as a case study has been an extraordinarily good example of how a voluntary disclosure and increasingly, I suppose, sort of more rigorous discussion around those climate issues has crowded in a really large number of people. So I think, you know, that's fantastic. And we know what TCFD is trying to measure. We're trying to work out how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions on the planet, right? Mm-hmm. What's much harder to do is when you break it down into perhaps more sort of social, cultural factors where we started the discussion, because you need to work out how do you solve for some of those things. You know, how do we really encourage consumer companies to not produce things that are going to be damaging for our children's health? You know, how do we really assess, you know, the damage that can be done through supply chains and human rights? And I think some of those things are just harder to measure, harder to get a grip on. But therefore, it really comes back to the whole point about culture has to be embedded in what you do as an organization. And I really do believe that many, many good things will come out of this terrible period that we've been living with. But one of the best things is that young people particularly will vote with their feet if they don't want to work for organizations where they feel the culture isn't positive, where they feel that what the company is doing is not adding to society. So I really have to be hopeful that if we can assess and collect the right data and information about what is going on, all of us will have an opportunity to make a bigger contribution to society as a whole. You're back, Sarah.
So, yes, apologies, I was rudely interrupted by internet gremlins, but never mind, the show must go on. So what I was about to say before I was rudely interrupted was, are you as an investor reassured by what you're hearing in terms of the coalition building that's taking place at the regulatory level? Are we getting the balance right? So it's back to this accuracy. Obviously, CDP has done some great work over the years, unfortunately often let down by people who sign up to an initiative and then it sits on the shelf as a piece of what we call in the software industry shelfware, and it just sits there for years and years, and a PRI has started throwing people off their platform if they don't actually make a meaningful contribution. Are we going to have people just want to get involved in these initiatives just to be seen to be associated with the latest hot thing? You know, we're all worried about greenwashing. So perhaps I could ask you just to talk a little bit about the role that you see for accurate measurement in trying to sort of get rid of the greenwashing, because this is not always about issuers disclosing, as we heard from Claudia's presentation yesterday in terms of the early reporters on the Stewardship Code. Investors, some of them can do their own greenwashing as well, or stewardship
doing
washing.
A quick test now to make sure that mainstay is working, and we've got all the technical bits going right. We had a little problem with the one-to-one sessions.
Sorry,
so Claudia.
Yeah, that's fine.
Technology.
So yeah, so I think you were asking Katherine the question, but I'm happy to jump in afterwards.
Either of you, I'd like you to both address that. There's greenwashing from issuers, there's greenwashing from investors. How are these changes going to try and eliminate greenwashing?
So there's a question, an answer I have, which is I think there's a role for sort of, you know, comparable data and comparable information being disclosed, but I think there's also a place for sort of more narrative, authentic reporting, which ties in much more to certainly speaks to the culture piece that you talked about, Katherine, because I don't think that sort of thing. I mean, whilst there's absolutely room for cultural indicators to be quantified, you know, as we found in looking at the corporate governance code, but also even before that in our reporting, those things are much more difficult to, you know, those things may be very, very different from one organization to another, and what's good for one organization might not be good for another in terms of culture. So I think there is a place for both, you know, sort of very detailed, comparable, specific data, particularly when you're talking about things like carbon emissions and on the basis of which, you know, and carbon pricing. But there's also when you're talking about things like, you know, the engagement of an employee's workforce with the organization's values. You know, those things are very difficult to transfer from one organization to another.
So I think back to your question as to you know, what's my perspective on, if you like, a coming together of regulators' perspectives on this, and is that helpful? I think it is, but I think at the same time, you know, don't underestimate what's been going on within organisations, slightly irrespective of what the regulator has been up to. I think actually sometimes companies get a bit of a sort of hard time for not doing enough, and yet, as Claudia quite rightly said, I think if you really scratch below the surface, people are doing a lot, and I think that it really does help us, you know, move forward. To your point about greenwashing, it actually used to drive me crazy that everyone and their dog would say, "Oh, I'm a signature to PRI," but when you actually again ask them, "Well, what are you doing about it?" they would be like, and so I think this idea where you have to be much more prescriptive about what you disclose, and there seems to be now quite a healthy area of competitiveness around PRI scores, and certainly, you know, at GIB we were absolutely delighted to be able to, you know, have A+ rankings for our strategy side and some of our other reporting mechanisms, and again, something that we can really talk positively about. But I think back to my point about where does culture start? Culture starts at the top of an organization, and then it then really permeates through, you know, like an artery with all the veins running through a body. And I think that if you just have some very worthy people ticking some boxes in a corporate governance department, that doesn't work for me. And no amount of regulation, bluntly, is going to shift that dial. You've got to have leaders at the top of these organizations who practice what they preach, who really live it every day, who are very purposeful in the way they speak. And the trick is going to be, as we move forward, how do we actually assign a value to that sort of hard to measure aspect? And where does it appear in corporate reporting? So to Claudia's point, I find it very either interestingly or distinctly uninteresting reading chairman and CEO's reports of the annual report and accounts. You know, sometimes you go, oh, they get it. Sometimes you nearly want to kill yourself because it's just so dire. But, you know, if you're doing good things, talk about it and don't be ashamed, because I think it ultimately will drive people to work for you. Customers will want to interface with you, and it becomes a really, really fulfilling cycle.
So when I joined the city back in the early 80s, there was a saying that went round, which was, if you can pardon the language, bullshit baffles brains. I have sat through interminable presentations with people spouting jargon. And ESG seems to have, and some cultural issues, seems to have developed a jargon all of its own, which to the uninitiated can be absolutely impenetrable. Now, Nigel Kershaw has actually raised a very, very important point about that, is we're sitting here amongst ourselves, patting ourselves on the back for sort of doing the right thing. Are we connecting with the end consumers? How can we make sure that the disclosure that starts in the boardroom actually comes across as authentic and accurate? I mean, after all, let's tell a story about accuracy and disclosure of data. If we look at food packets, we've got traffic lights, we've got detailed disclosure about calories, but we've still got problems with obesity and people not understanding the data that they are receiving. I think we've got a real responsibility as sort of financial intermediaries to say, how can we help the ordinary consumer make sense of this? It goes back to Adrian's sort of whole sort of theme about transparency and trust building. You know, Boohoo said, yeah, of course we take these things seriously. They didn't. Where in the chain do you think we can make improvements so that those values that the CEO and the chair are talking about are felt on the sort of on the shop floor, and also that the consumers actually do genuinely believe and trust what they are seeing?
I mean, excellent point, because, and I see, you know, Nigel's narrative around transparency. I mean, I think for some time I've felt very strongly that people have tried to bamboozle retail investors and just not give them the right information. So anything that we can do to encourage organizations to be much, frankly, you know, much more open in terms of what they're describing as to the business model, what you're getting involved in, I think that can only be a positive thing. And I think, generally speaking, we have to mobilize people, because I think, you know, one of the, again, tragic implications of the COVID crisis is that probably most of us are going to have to work for a lot longer than we ever imagined. And with what's happening in terms of the shape of investment markets, you can't expect to see a fantastic return anytime soon. So even more so, I think we need to put greater power into the hands of retail investors through transparent communications, so that people have a much better chance of making decisions about their own financial futures that will enable them to live a better life when it comes to retirement.
So Claudia, is the retail voice heard inside
so we've
the FRC?
done quite a lot of work too. We had a citizens jury last year to try and pick up on, you know, it was really actually to do with our own organizational purpose and trying to, you know, we had a new CEO and chair, and really establishing, you know, whose interests we operate in behalf. So we do that. We also have a stakeholder advisory panel where we try and channel the number of representative organizations that represent different stakeholders that are involved with us. But I think as to whether or not the end user is receiving I guess accurate and understandable, we talked about this point about fair, balanced and understandable reporting, I think there's much more work to be done. In the Stewardship Code, we've actually introduced a requirement for around communication with beneficiaries and clients with respect to stewardship. So I think there's quite a lot of good work going on to communicate information about the value of pension funds, value of pension pots to customers, but actually the fact that they can this in some way, and you know, we've seen from a study, a video that Quiet Room did about this sort of vox pop. People on the street don't even know that their pensions are invested in companies. So there's a huge way to go to get the person, you know, the average person to understand that, and even quite informed people to understand that they have an opportunity, and they also should very much exercise that responsibility to that, but they can't do that unless they understand or provided with information that is understandable. So I think there is a role to play, but also encouraging, there's a number of different initiatives, and I know that there can often be initiatives that don't necessarily go anywhere, but as part of the Asset Management Task Force, there's a subgroup that's working on that to report, and it looks like there will be something that comes out of that that's very much going to look at the information that is passed on to pensioners, and doing a lot more work with beneficiaries and members to communicate, you know, what investors do with their money on behalf, and as well as investing, you know, some of these engagement with companies, and how that can have a lot of influence and power. So I think, you know, there's more work to be done, but I think it's going in the right direction, and it's encouraging. Whether or not it's fast enough, I don't know.
Can I just also come in? Can I just come in quickly? Sorry, Sarah. I was going to say that I think in addition to transparency, it really does start with education. And I think that you've got to start young. I think there have been, you know, many great programs that I've been involved with around financial literacy. And if you can start in school, just explaining the very basics to children, that's something that will stick with them for a very long time. You know, we are all taught in school to learn our times tables. It's something we hold within us forever. You know, some of the basic things that, you know, many organizations have done through philanthropic or CSR activities make a massive difference. And so I really do think that it's part of our responsibility for those of us who are in finance, and hopefully, you know, we've learned through the years, and we've got a better chance of hopefully making some better decisions. We've got to pass on that responsibility to others who are literally starting from ground zero. And I think that is an incredibly important task for all of us.
I couldn't agree more. And actually, if anybody's interested, I have posted the link to the Quiet Room Responsible Investing page with the video that you can get. Katherine, you're in it's quite an unusual position, because you've worked for a Scottish organisation, an English organisation, and now you're working for a company which is based outside the UK. Do you think that there are sort of any cultural or values issues that you've seen in your new organisation that you think are worth sharing? Do we take sometimes too narrow approach in how we think about culture, just from a, you know, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant perspective?
It's a very good question, and I think probably the biggest learning I've taken away from my experience working from a Middle Eastern organization is that the Middle East has an incredibly young population. So particularly in, for instance, Saudi Arabia, about 70% of the population is under the age of 30. So what I found incredibly refreshing is when I go to the region and have discussions about environmental, social and governance factors, it's absolutely alive. And so if there's a force for change, it is absolutely being driven by the younger population. And there's this burning need to do something about the future that they see, which frankly doesn't look great. So if you have hopefully, you know, impassioned individuals who want to make a difference in their own organizations, and you connect it with deeply passionate and purposeful younger generation representatives, if you bring those two together, the arrowhead can be incredibly important. So I think that's probably been, you know, one of the most enlightening things from my perspective. I think, you know, the other thing is that it is about wanting to be very purposeful. I saw a survey this week which said that 79% of CEOs now believe that purpose is even more important in their organization versus before COVID. So this is really live. And I can honestly tell you, having just recruited 2 fantastic graduates to GIB in the last few months, that this element of purpose and culture and what you're trying to do as an organization is writ large in their brains. You know, they don't want to work for companies where they feel you're doing bad things on behalf of bad people, and you're not going to really benefit society. So I think, you know, it's the younger generation that I am so optimistic about.
Well, can I just pick up on the point that Katherine made, because it's interesting hearing it from your perspective. And certainly when we spoke to, you know, this, I'm talking a couple of years ago, when we spoke to lots of CEOs and chairs about the importance of culture in the organizations, they were, you know, you were getting so many almost like not stock answers, but people were saying the best way to understand the culture is to walk the floor. And of course, that's not so possible, certainly not at the moment, but also in the international organizations. I'm sort of baffled by the fact that hearing companies say how important culture is and how important purpose is, and that it's a driving factor, and yet the sort of generally quite poor standard of disclosure that we're getting in terms of corporate governance code from companies. I mean, we're not getting interesting, authentic, and you know, reporting that tells a story, and we're having sort of quite circular discussions with organizations about how we monitor and measure culture. And you know, if these organizations have, so, you know, I don't mean to be too critical, but having all this great talent, you know, there must be some way to crack how you use these indicators and look at these problems. But at the moment, the disclosures that we're getting through from companies are just sort of, you know, on the whole, we think they could be much better improved.
And I think, you know, one of the reasons for that, sorry, Sarah, just to hop in, is that I think for years, some of the disclosures that would really help us have been just sort of parked in the CSR department somewhere, sort of, you know, in the bottom drawer. And they've got to be elevated in terms of being absolutely integral to how people will look at and review companies. And I saw there was a question from Bob earlier in the session about asset managers who are not being transparent about voting policies. And I have to tell you, I think there's a massive disconnect. Back to Claudia's point, you know, there are serious platitudes going on at the boardroom level. And then when you look inside their reporting, are they actually doing what they say? No. I think there was something this week where, you know, one of the world's biggest asset managers saying, yes, we're absolutely out there, you know, we're promoting climate change, you know, and we're going to do everything we can. And then you look at their voting policies and they vote against anything that's actually going to take the argument forward. So there is just a real disconnect here.
So that actually leads very much into what I was going to ask you about the role of intermediaries in organizations who are filtering out messages. So it's absolutely great to hear, Claudia, that you are going in at the highest level, chairs and CEOs and finance directors, and Katherine as an investor, yeah, you likewise. But there are not many chairs and CEOs out there. There are very, very many more intermediaries who are feeding advice to those boards about what should or shouldn't go in. And there's a whole industry which is biased around the status quo of doing it their way or whatever. I hope that we've now got buy-in from more of the senior leaders, and they're kind of getting it, that their job is on the line, that shareholders can vote them out, or at least in some countries they can be anyway. But it's the next layer down. It's, you know, there are people in this world who are simplifiers and those who are complexifiers because they make a lot of money out of making things complex. How do we reach into them to actually say, this is the vision, this is what the consumers want. Now, you either get out of the way or you help your companies make this happen. What are we going to do with those people who just want to complexify?
I mean, I think in terms of reaching the sort of, I guess I'm not sure I'll answer that question, but more in terms of how you say reaching the middle. I think, you know, back to Katherine's point, there's some genuinely committed individuals and organisations seeking to make this better, and you know, and thankfully we get to work with quite a lot of them, and we don't, you know, we do tend to work with people who are trying to be at the forefront, so we know we need to pick up the laggards as well. But I think, you know, there's also quite a lot of people who are really, you know, we're doing a lot of sort of things like reverse mentoring, for example, you know, trying to take the knowledge in the middle management or in even, you know, entry level and the innovation and try and pass that back up to senior leadership so that they understand, you know, the importance of this and they understand the feeling, and then there's the role for senior leadership to be accepting of this information that's passed up to them, or accepting of these challenges, and very much, you know, encourage and invite challenge and not just invite the sort of answer that they perhaps want to hear and the simplify. Because I think for many of these things, the reason that we can't get to the stage of consistent metrics for ESG is because it's very, very difficult, and you're measuring, you know, you've got this huge, well, like, you know, we say ESG and we ban this term around, but it means so many different things. You know, it's a huge pot of different issues, which is ever growing, and there's so many different ways to measure and monitor them. So we do need to find, at least get to a few, which, and I know there's lots of progress being made, and land on those and start reporting on those. I mean, that was sort of our view going back to culture in the board, is for the board just get a few metrics and start somewhere. Don't be so overwhelmed by the size of the task that you don't do anything. And I think there's a lot of, you know, there's growing information and evidence that we need to draw on. I think it's really important that we do draw on the evidence base and not just necessarily sign up to what we think is the right thing, or perhaps what we want to hear, because not all the evidence does point to you know, making certain investments, I suppose.
So Robert has chimed in here with an observation, not a question, that, you know, we should treat behaviour as the true disclosure, which is probably right. So we'll have to see how companies respond to the stewardship and the frameworks, and if it's not accurate in the early days, if the measurements that we're not getting are not truly accurate in the early days, everything is perfectible. So we've got like 2 minutes to go before we move over to the centre stage. So I would like to sort of finish. We've had a very far-reaching conversation: culture, the whole DNA of an organisation as measured by the culture and through its disclosures. So how are we going to get to this sort of vision of better reporting and accurate reporting? Catherine, if you had one wish, be careful what you wish for. What do you think is the thing that will make the biggest difference
is to get
right now?
Industry affirmation to collect data that will enable us to really measure some of the harder issues that we've just been talking about, you know, culture in particular. So let's collect it, let's measure it, let's report on it, and then people will vote with their feet.
Yeah, so tricky question. I mean, I think we would welcome, certainly the FRC would welcome a sort of global standard setter. So, you know, in relation to environmental, social and governance disclosures, particularly in relation to climate. So I think that would be, it's a tricky place to get to. I think there's many vested interests, and, you know, I don't think, for example, us leaving the European Union is going to help us, our position in relation to that. But, you know, but that's, you know, that's sort of where we are. But we certainly have a lot of influence in the UK still. So I'm sure that there's lots of opportunity for us to make inroads. And I think it's, you know, even with the disclosure, you know, the publication of the World Economic Forum paper, you know, all of this is adding to us closer towards getting some sort of resolution. So I think that would be the ideal.
And
definitely
so,
glass
are you
half
glass
full?
half full,
Always
glass
an
half
optimist.
empty, or just grateful you've got a glass at all?
I think that we have a collaboratively, there is a great opportunity and responsibility to be involved in solving some of the world's most significant problems, and I think glass half full is definitely where I would like to be.
Outstanding. Okay, ladies, thank you so much. It's been really interesting to hear your points of view. You've all been on some very interesting journeys over the last 5 or 6 years. I know that from sort of following your own careers. And there's very much a common thread which comes through about coalition building, talking, even where people are disagreeing with one another, to actually propel people forward. And Katherine, I couldn't agree more about getting young people actually involved in financial knowledge and education building, because they are very much our future. So I'm going to wrap up there. I don't believe there's any more questions coming through. So I'll thank you very much. We finished pretty much on time. We're about 30 seconds over. So we should all now be heading over to the main stage, and our keynote speaker for the afternoon is, I know, waiting in the green room as we speak.
Thanks.
So
Sarah.
thank you so
Thanks.
much,
Bye.
everybody.
Claudia.
It's been a pleasure,
Bye.
and see you all very soon, I hope. Bye-bye.